Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of our college football rankings. This week, going into week 4, we have a little bit of shakeup in our rankings. We a lot towards the bottom of the list, like we've seen throughout the past few weeks. Basically, in that 15 to 25 spot, we're going to see a lot of movement after this week with some upsets overall and some teams that are moving up into our rankings, some teams that moved out. There's a lot going on this week. So with that being said, we're just going to kick it off in the 25 spot. In my 25 spot, I have Iowa. They weren't ranked before. This week going into this, I think they should be ranked up to this point. They're 3-0. They continue to roll with that rushing game. LaShawn Williams and Kamari Moulton, both of them on the ground, 145 yards from Williams. Kamari Moulton, 2 rushing touchdowns overall. And they do have a good rushing attack. Obviously, they have a high-profile quarterback who transferred there this year, and he was all right in the game, a few interceptions, but he did have a few touchdowns overall. But going into this week against Penn State, it is going to be tough. But if they do want to have a chance in this game, I think they have to stick to that rushing game. So we'll see if Penn State can attack that rushing game overall with their defense. They do have a lot of good linebackers and edge rushers. So we'll see how they fare this week, but new to the rankings for me.
Yeah, and at number 25, I have Washington State. I have them bumped down a spot. They beat up on a Northern Colorado team, and the drop of the spot, I wouldn't take it too seriously. I just think there's other teams that have impressed me more, but Washington State definitely deserves to be ranked in my head. They have a big game coming up against Oregon State, and if Cam Ward can step up like he has been so far, I expect a big jump for them. Obviously, I have Oregon State on my list as well, so they're definitely a team that deserves to be in the top 25. They're in the 25 spot for me, so I liked what I saw last week as well.
And next up, in my 24 spot, I have a new team here. Once again, we have Florida. This week, as everyone saw, probably the most televised game of the week besides the Colorado one. They played against Tennessee in the swamp, and Travis Etienne, 172 rushing yards and a touchdown. Graham Mertz could be next Tim Tebow in Florida. We'll see what happens with that. But this team overall, I mean, they were good. It was going to be a tough SEC matchup, especially in Florida. It's always tough once the conference play starts. And they got through the fraud Tennessee team overall. I know you'll talk a little bit more about them later. Tennessee, not completely out of it up to this point. I mean, they can still definitely go on in that SEC overall that isn't that competitive. Georgia has proven that they are the top team this year, and even them, they had a rough game this week and overall this season, but they still do have an outside chance. I think you could definitely still make a New Year's Six Bowl. I think they'll be back in the rankings soon. But overall, that Florida team solid, and I have them at 24 right now after that big win for them. So I think they'll continue to keep it rolling.
Yeah, at 24, that's where I have Iowa. As you mentioned, their run game has been unbelievable, and I think their defense is their strongest asset. Seeing Cade McNamara struggle against a team like Western Michigan doesn't strike too much fear into me, but at the end of the day, they're a Big Ten team that's 3-0. They've looked convincing, even against Iowa State, which was a tougher matchup for them. And as you mentioned, they have to travel to Penn State for the whiteout game. Me and Banning will both be there, so we'll make sure to take some videos for the Instagram. Should be a good time. But just in order to win that game, they need some offensive firepower. Obviously, with an environment like Beaver Stadium with the whiteout, you need a big play to silence the crowd at some point, and this Iowa team is really just not built for that. So I don't expect huge things against Penn State. It's going to be a tough game for them, but if their defense stays shut down and they can just run the ball, I mean, anything could happen. So Iowa's at 24. They deserve a spot. I completely agree. I like them there.
Next up in the 23 spot, I have Clemson. They moved up 1 ranking for me this week. I know they're not officially on the AP poll. If you look throughout some places have them even higher too. I still believe that they should be ranked. Obviously, they lost that first game versus Duke, but since then, obviously they're playing against FAU. So not a big matchup for them overall, but Cade Klubnik went out there and he had 4 touchdowns overall. The running game was good. The passing game was all right. The defense is still there. I still think this is a ranked team. I still think this is a top 25 team up to this point. And they say that everything comes in threes, 3 passing touchdowns, 3 rushing touchdowns, and 3 interceptions for this team. I still think they're a solid squad.
Yeah. For 23, I have Tennessee. Obviously, I'm a Tennessee fan if you're just watching for the first time. And a super disappointing result. playing at Florida in the swamp, at a nighttime game is pretty tough, and the Vols just didn't look ready. Their defense was abysmal, to be honest. They gave Florida offense way too many chances, whether it's penalties or long third down conversions. It happened all night. Once the Vols fell behind, Florida used that opportunity to get good chunk plays and use up a lot of the clock. As you mentioned, Trevor Etienne was awesome on the ground game, and Tennessee's whole, method is to get up early, move really fast, and make teams have to play from behind. Their secondary doesn't look as bad as it really is some nights because they know teams are going to have to pass on them, and that's just not what happened. So obviously, Florida catches a lead, runs the ball really well, and Tennessee had no idea what they were doing. With that being said, I still think they're a top 25 team in the country. They're going to compete going forward. That's just a really tough loss to take. And, as you have on your poll and I have on mine, and I'll mention next time I'm talking, but I think it's kind of ridiculous to have Tennessee ranked higher than Florida. I think the preseason polls are really fun and they are important to a sense, but after Florida beat a Tennessee team that that what just happened, and they did so convincingly, I don't understand how a lot of these major polls and websites are ranking Tennessee above Florida, because based on the results we saw, Tennessee's not a better team than the Gators right now. So that's something I wanted to point out. Tennessee disappointed me a lot, but with the way their schedule is shaping up, I think they rise up in the next couple of weeks.
Next up in the 22 spot, I have UCLA. They moved up 3 spots for me this week. Overall, playing against North Carolina Central. They win by 52, though, and I was very impressed by this running game overall. 404 total yards from the rushing game, 6 touchdowns overall. Dante Moore only had to get 8 completions on 12 attempts to still win this game by 52. They put up 35 in the first quarter, and that was pretty much it. That was the nail in the coffin. After that, everything else was just adding on to the stats. But this UCLA team, I think, is good. I think they're a legit team. They're going to be going up against Utah this week, which is going to be a tough game, especially in Utah. But I've seen some sparks from Dante Moore. I don't think that he's the best passer overall, but obviously he's a mobile guy and he can get out there and make the throws when he needs to. Obviously, I don't think this team's going to have 404 rushing yards against this Utah team and that defense, but if they can capitalize and run the ball very well, it is going to be a good matchup for them. In Utah, I expect it to be a close game. The line right now is at 4.5, and I think it'll be less than a touchdown game. It could go either way, depending on what we see from Utah's quarterback play. So I think it'll be a good game, and I do think UCLA is still a solid squad.
Yeah, and they missed out on my rankings, but they're right there for me. 22, I have Florida. As I mentioned, just talked about them a lot. I think they found the way that they're going to win games going forward, and that's running the ball. They know Etienne is a good back, but you really got to force feed him sometimes. And I'll let Graham Mertz be a game manager. That's kind of what he was at Wisconsin, obviously coming to Florida. He should be in that same role. He's not a guy that you should expect to pass for, 35, 40 times a game. It's just not how you're going to win games. Their defense was really impressive. They held Tennessee to 0-3 on 4th downs. So if that defense continues to get big stops, obviously they have a pretty solid D-line, and they just run the ball. It's not the most exciting style of football, but for a team that's playing in the SEC and a team that, plays some hard-nosed football like Florida does, I think it's the way they're going to win. So 22, better than Tennessee. Hurts to say, but it's true.
Next up in the 21 spot, I have Miami, who also moved up 2 spots for me this week. Tyler Van Dyke, 247 yards, 2 touchdowns, and the team overall had 5 total rushing touchdowns. They do have a bye next week, so they might end up falling maybe 1 or 2 spots just because some other teams could really improve for me. But they are still a team that I have basically on the edge of the top 20. There's going to be a lot of teams that we're going to see some movement from, especially in that top 15 area. So I still think this team has a good chance this year. Overall, it's going to be a competitive division just because UNC and Duke are both solid this year, and obviously Florida State. So it's going to be an interesting division overall. They are going to have the bye week this week, like I said, but then they have UNC, Clemson, Florida State, all to end the season. So they could still end up the season ranked. I think they're a solid squad. We'll just have to see what happens. And I think Tyler Van Dyke is a good quarterback overall. I know there's some mixed opinions on him. He does have his moments, but sometimes he can get in a spot where he can struggle. But this week he was good, and so far this season he's been good.
Yeah. And at 21, I have another ACC team. I have Clemson. They're back up my rankings. They weren't here last week, but I think they deserve the 21 spot. They have a huge matchup against Florida State on the horizon, and the winner of this game has potential to jump up crazy in both of our lists, I assume. Klubnik didn't have to do a whole lot against FAU last week, but obviously going to have a tall task against the Seminoles defense. And we saw guys like Jaden Daniels. I mean, Daniels was good in that first game, but he had moments where he struggled. And I don't think I'm going out on a limb saying he's a better quarterback than Klubnik. So we could see Klubnik have similar struggles to an extent. And I know a lot of it was garbage time, but they let up almost 300 yards to FAU. And that's something that they really got to pin down on their defense. Historically, Clemson's defense in like the last 10, 15 years has been, a shining part of that team. And I'm kind of waiting to see that this year. So Florida State game's going to be big, but Clemson is going to be ranked for me this week.
And next up in the 20th spot, I have Washington State. I'm a little bit higher on them than I know you are. This team overall is going into a tough matchup next week with Oregon State. But if they continue to being able to throw the ball well with Cam Ward, who has been great this year, 327 yards and 4 touchdowns. I think if they can go into this game with some momentum, obviously it's going to be tough, but you are at home against Oregon State. It's going to be a close game, and Oregon State is high on both of our rankings. They're a good team this season, so this is a very big game for Washington State. If they can pull it out at home, they will move up a good amount. I don't think it's crazy to say they should be in the top 15 at least after that win if they beat Oregon State, but either way, even if they don't win this game and they still keep it close, this team overall is still good, and they can move back up if they lose. But Cam Ward, if he can continue to look good, I think this team has a good shot going into this weekend.
For sure. And continuing my ACC stretch, I have Miami at 20. I have them a spot above Clemson. They just, have more impressive wins, I guess. They're pretty close for me, but they're 3-0. They're handling business. They're absolutely murdering lower competition. And Allen and Chaney Jr. look like they could be a good backfield duo. We know Van Dyke, he can be in and out of the spotlight, but he always, he's been looking pretty solid this year. There's a lot of hype around him, a Heisman campaign. Maybe if they, go on a roll and keep winning games. But that running game needs to step up for me. They have so far, so continue to do good things. And next week they take on Temple. They really got to go out and slaughter the Owls and hopefully improve to 4-0. They could take jumps in this poll, especially because teams that we've talked about that are in front of them right now, they could be looking at losses, and that would obviously shake things up. So Hurricanes are at 20, potential to get into the teens. Really good for a team I didn't really expect to be here.
Yeah, a team that I didn't really expect to be here still too. Duke, I have them at 19. I was very surprised, especially going into the first week when they went out and got that win, but they've continued to keep it rolling. Riley Leonard with 320 total yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. He proved that game that he was being able to throw the ball offensively and being able to run the ball too well. This team overall, 5 total touchdowns. They're going into an easy game this week, so they should be able to go out there and win by a good amount over the UConn team that isn't that great. So they can keep the ball rolling here. And with some teams in the top 15 area, top 15 to 20, playing against some big competition, they do have the chance to move up again. And they are going to have to get into some big games in the future, as we'll see with this ACC schedule. But they are solid right now, and Riley Leonard, if he can keep that going, throwing the ball and rushing the ball, this will be a good team.
Yeah, for sure. And still talking about the ACC, this is where I have North Carolina. Drake May had a ton of yards on a Minnesota defense that's not really good, but the 2 interceptions do make me a little bit worried. Obviously, a big storyline about Drake May's season this year has been that ball security, and it hasn't been to the insane accurate levels that we've seen in the past. The run game for UNC also has to get going a little bit, especially because they're going to have to take on Miami sooner than later. But that game's going to be really solid. Those are obviously 2 of the best teams in the ACC. And outside of those minor worries, let's not forget UNC just killed Minnesota. They do look really good. I love what I see from their secondary most of the time. So UNC is going to be a team that, I see being on this list for this foreseeable future. I have them at 19.
And next up, I have Colorado at 18, the team that is still the most talked about. We saw everyone was there last week for their big rivalry matchup against CSU. Obviously, the spread, they should have won this game by a lot more. But looking at this game, down at halftime, this game was very tough overall. CSU went into this game. Obviously, they were talking a lot before the game. This game became personal, and especially after that Travis Hunter hit on the sideline, after the play, basically, that it became even more personal. He's going to be out for a few weeks, which is going to be tough. But we saw offensively and defensively, Shedeur Sanders, 350 yards and 4 touchdowns going into overtime, keeping his poise. He had some great moments, especially in the end of the fourth quarter, going down and going essentially 100-yard drive to win that game going into overtime. And then they went in there too and scored touchdowns and the 2-point conversion. Shiloh Sanders on the other end got a pick six, a fumble recovery. And this team didn't win by that much against the team they should have won by more. But overall, they're still a solid team. They are going to go up against Oregon this week. The spread's already 20.5. Travis Hunter is going to be out. And even if Colorado loses this game, even if they lose by 20 points like they're supposed to, they can still go out here and have a good season. If they can get into a bowl game, then that is still a win. I think even if they lose this game by a lot, this team was projected to win 2.5 games. And through 3 weeks, they've already beat their win total. And obviously, there's a lot going into this. When you're the team that has the most eyes on you, there's people talking about them obviously going to the national championship. The hype is real. This team isn't that good yet, but they've already exceeded expectations, and they still can be competitive throughout the rest of the year. If this team can win 6 or 7 games, then that is a massive achievement. And I'm not writing them off against Oregon. You never know what can happen, especially if Shedeur Sanders can keep going out there. But without Travis Hunter, it is going to be tough. You're essentially losing arguably your best player on offense and defense. So it is going to be tough. But this team overall, it was very big to watch that game. When they were down at halftime, they easily could have just given up. But as we know, Coach Prime went out there, gave him a halftime speech. They went into overtime, and Shedeur Sanders really showed us that he could be in the Heisman race this year. We moved him up to 4 in our rankings, and he kept his poise in that game. And even without his number 1 target on offense, he still went out there and got it done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll talk about Colorado in a little bit. But at 18, I have my last ACC team for a while. This is where I put Duke. I have them above UNC. I mean, that head-to-head matchup is enough for me to put them one spot higher. But Riley Leonard, as you mentioned, really good game against Northwestern, especially on the ground. As we know, with the hype that Duke's getting right now he's trying to build up an NFL draft resume, and showing some versatility should help. So that ground game was impressive for me. The Blue Devils need to roll over UConn right now. They should go in and win by a pretty hefty margin because they need all their momentum when they take on Notre Dame at home. That's going to be a big game, assuming Duke gets a win here. And we'll talk about that Notre Dame, game against Ohio State next week later. But Duke, just needs to keep this momentum going. Having them above UNC, Miami, and Clemson right now is not something I expected at all, but I don't mind it. They are more than just a hype train with one good win. They're a really solid football team, and I think a lot of people, including myself, underrated them to start the year. So I really like what I've seen from Leonard, really like what I've seen from Duke. I think they're going to go out and possibly be ranked even higher next week.
Yeah, I have UNC now at 17. They moved up 3 spots for me this week. Drake May did have 2 interceptions, but besides that, 414 yards in the air and 2 touchdowns. This team looked good. There were some points where they struggled, and they were playing against a Minnesota team that it was still pretty decent this year. I know they weren't talked about as much overall, but Minnesota has been decent the past few years, and especially a matchup like that is always tough in ACC going into a Big Ten team overall. But this team, I mean, the passing attack was good. Nate McCullum, 165 yards and a touchdown, and they're going into next week, going against a Pitt team, and they are going on the road. And it is going to be tough as we get into these ACC and just overall these conference matchups. Pitt, obviously not the best team in all of college football right now, but it is still going to be a tough game. They're going to have to grind it out. And the spread's only 7.5 right now. I think UNC will be able to get through this, but it is going to be a tough showing, and they should be able to go out there and get it done.
Yeah, and at 17, this is where I have Colorado. You pretty much said all that need to be said, but I just want to point out that Colorado and Colorado State is one of the best rivalries in college football. The spread obviously was big because there's a talent gap there, but emotions run high. It's a big game every year, whether you've been watching or not. So seeing the Buffs come out on top of that one, even if it was in overtime, it's still a good game for me. Travis Hunter going out is going to be a really big deal. As you mentioned, they get Oregon next week. Then they get USC after that. It's going to be a tough stretch, but I think Colorado being a team that I think is very likely to get a bowl game this year is impressive enough in itself. And obviously, if they get a win against either of those teams, they're going to find their way on our rankings regardless. So good game from Colorado. Coach Prime is legit. The rumors of him just being a talking head that doesn't actually do much is like completely blown out of the water now. We've seen the results. So I love Colorado. I think their story is great. I'm hoping they can shock the world and be on our list either next week or the week after, because if they beat one of those teams, they're going to be.
Next up, in the 16 spot, I have Oregon State. DJ Ungalilea did have 2 picks this game with only 1 touchdown. They did beat up on a San Diego State team 26-9. They did struggle a little bit to start the game. And San Diego State was on my rankings to start in our week 0 rankings. I still think they're a solid team, even though they're 2-2. They've put in some hard work every single week, and whoever they play, it's been a tough matchup. And a little bit of adversity for Ungalilea. It is going to be interesting, like I said before, going into Washington State. I think Cameron Ward is the better quarterback. I don't think that's really a hot take. I still don't really believe in Ungalilea. I think there's still some spots that we've seen, even in this game against San Diego State, where he struggled. So it just depends on how the rest of the team is going to play. I wouldn't be shocked by a Washington State upset. Like I said before, only a 2.5-point spread in Washington State. One of these teams is going to come out with a big win this week. And I think Cam Ward, the better quarterback. I do think Oregon State is the better team overall. So it'll be a good game to watch. Just fun overall.
Yeah, for sure. 16, I have Oregon State as well. We haven't really seen DJ be that guy yet, but as we mentioned, I like what they've seen, what I've seen from their defense. And I say it every week. I'll say it again. Damian Martinez is one of my guys. He just runs hard. He's possibly, in my opinion, the most underrated running back in college football right now. Even when DJ struggles, the offense moves because Martinez is really, really solid. Washington State and Utah back-to-back. It's going to kick off a tough Pac-12 stretch, so it's going to be interesting. As you mentioned, that Washington State game is going to be really good. Obviously, the winner of that is going to get some credit in our rankings, so excited for that as well.
And next up in the 15 spot, we got Oklahoma here. Dillon Gabriel, 420 yards and 5 touchdowns. Nick Anderson, 3 receptions for 120 yards and 3 touchdowns. A big game. And every single week, it seems like Oklahoma is putting up a bunch of points like they usually do every year. And my big question going into this season was if Dillon Gabriel could be the guy. And so far, he has been the guy. This Oklahoma team, I know it's a little ranked a little lower in the actual AP polls, but this team is very solid. And if they continue this momentum, they are going to be able to push for a title in that division. And I mean, they could be a dark horse for the playoffs up to this point. If they can win out, I wouldn't be surprised if they can get into there. It just depends on how Dillon Gabriel can do and how far this team can go. But they have the weapons, and the offense has been incredible through these games. We'll have to see what it looks like when they actually start going up against some real teams. But it's good for them right now. And the Big 12 championship, whoever is in that, is going to be very fun to watch because we are going to see some big offenses in that game. So we'll see. I wouldn't be surprised if Oklahoma gets their name in there in a few weeks. We just got to see how they go against some tough defenses. I want to see how Dillon Gabriel looks. But for now, looking very good.
Yeah, and I have Oklahoma at 15. I completely agree. Originally, I thought this matchup against Cincinnati would be a good one on their schedule. Obviously, a team that can be kind of streaky, good sometimes. They had a big playoff run a couple years ago, but just based on how Cincinnati's played so far, I think Oklahoma is going to beat them by 40-something, just keep on rolling. So obviously, once they get up against these high caliber teams, they're going to have a lot of momentum, and that's not something that should go unnoticed. I mean, you can talk about having a weak schedule all you want, but they're doing exactly what they have to do. They're building momentum. The offense is really trying everything, and everything's working. So, yeah, they're a team that's going to fight in the Big 12 all year. I think 15 is very fair for, their ranking. It's higher than a lot of people, as you mentioned. But I think this Oklahoma team is legit, and can't wait to see them against higher competition.
Next up, we have Ole Miss in the 14 spot. Jackson Dart, 250 yards on only 10 completions, 136 rushing yards from him, and 2 touchdowns. He proved that he can be a dual threat quarterback, especially in this game. 300 total rushing yards from the team and 5 total rushing touchdowns. But the big question going into next week, they are going against Alabama in Alabama. I think if this was in Ole Miss, it is a completely different look. But as we know, it's always tough to win in Alabama. I think it's going to be a close game, but we'll talk about Alabama next as I have them in the 13 spot. We'll see what happens with this game. It's always tough. I know Alabama, a lot of people say they shouldn't be this high. They only are this high because of the name, but that defense itself and the rest of the offense, I mean, their only real issue right now is the quarterback spot. They have three guys going out there, but if they go into this game and what we've seen and what we've heard is that Milroe is playing, I think Ole Miss wins that game if Milroe is playing. I think they go out there, and I believe the Ole Miss offense is a lot better. I believe in Jackson Dart more than I believe in whichever quarterback Alabama throws out there. I mean, at this rate, they're probably going to have four quarterbacks, one for each quarter. And I mean, Alabama could prove me wrong and come out and win this game. But so far this year, betting against Alabama has me on a winning streak. So I'm going to stay with it, and I'm going to stick with Jackson Dart in the Ole Miss.
Yeah, and I'll talk more about Bama when we get to them. But at 14, I have Ole Miss as well, and I'm really looking forward to this game. This might be, I mean, that Ohio State Notre Dame game is going to be big, but this game is also going to be almost equally as big, in my opinion. If they win, it gets them in the top 10 spot. I think that's pretty fair to say. And Jackson Dart last week, 3 touchdowns, 2 of those on the ground. And Jordan Watkins, I mean, they make this Ole Miss offense look really, really good. So I'm going to wait on a prediction until we finish talking about Alabama, but I really wouldn't be surprised if Ole Miss can go out and get this one. The offense is really solid, and as we'll mention, Alabama's offensive struggles do have me a little bit worried for what's going to happen once we go to Tuscaloosa.
And next up, like you said, talking about Alabama, their QB situation is going to ruin them this season. When you say that you have 2 quarterbacks, at this point, 3 quarterbacks, that means that you don't have any. They just don't have any belief in their quarterbacks, it seems like, going back and forth with Milroe not playing. And last week, I mean, they struggled against South Florida, and it was just a bad game to watch overall. I mean, South Florida, not a good program, especially right now, and just a tough game overall. Only 107 passing yards between both of their quarterbacks, but the 200 rushing yards, the 5 sacks from the defense is what kept them in this game. It just wasn't that impressive against South Florida. Like I said before, though, they're playing in Alabama. It's always tough to win in Alabama, depending on who this team is. The Alabama team overall is a lot better than the Ole Miss team. But if that offense on Ole Miss, I'm taking their offense. The passing attack with Jackson Dart, especially on the ground, which we saw last week too. And overall, I mean, this Ole Miss team is going to be good. Like you said, it is going to be a good game. Offensively, we'll see what happens. If Alabama can keep up, then that defense in Alabama is a lot better. But Quinshon Judkins, I still think, is one of the best running backs in the country right now. We haven't seen a lot from him yet, but if he gets unleashed this game, especially between him and Jackson Dart, it's going to be a good one. This Alabama team can hold them. The defense is good enough to hold them. They're one of the best defenses in the country in any position that you look at. So whoever wins this game will be in the top 10. And if Alabama wins this game, a big statement win, they'll be back in the top 10 rankings again, and they'll be back in the SEC championship picture. But if Ole Miss wins, they'll be in the championship picture too. This is going to be a big game, especially with LSU, who we'll talk about later. It's going to be interesting to see who plays Georgia in the SEC championship.
So who do you got in the game?
I said before, Ole Miss, I'm taking them.
All right, fair enough. Yeah, so 13, I have Bama as well. In my opinion, I guess it could be a hot take at this point. I think Jalen Milroe is the best QB on the team. I know that Texas game was a little disappointing, but like not enough to bench someone, especially Texas is a team that, you know, as you'll see as we talk about them, are very high in our rankings. It's a good team. And they just have no momentum right now. And, you know, getting ready to play against Ole Miss, who we've said good things about the whole episode. I mean, it's not a good place to be at all. But I think Jalen Milroe is your best option. It sounds like that's the way they're going. And, I mean, they need to win this game to keep fighting for the playoffs. Alabama with 2 losses to Texas and Ole Miss is not a playoff team. And, you know, unless Alabama plans to take a pretty big fall off, this is not a place that they want to be at all. In my opinion, though, as you mentioned, Alabama's defense is good enough to hold almost anyone in the country. Obviously, Quinn Ewers and Mitchell and Worthy, you know, kind of had explosive plays all over them. but I don't necessarily know if that's the level that Ole Miss is at. I got burned by picking Alabama before, and I'm going to get possibly burned by picking them again. I don't think it's going to be a blowout. I'm not taking any spread here. I think it's going to be a really, really good game. But maybe just for argument's sake, I do think Alabama goes out and wins this game. It's back against the wall. Nick Saban is still one of the best coaches in college football, if not the best. They need to win this game to have any life this year, and I think they do. But it's not going to be a pretty one. I think Ole Miss could put up points in a hurry if they have to. But I'll roll with the Crimson Tide once again. Hopefully that doesn't get burned on the TikTok or anything, but let's go Crimson Tide, just for this 1 week. So I sound smart.
Well, and the week before that we saw too. Guys, when he said he was a Tennessee fan, he's actually lying. He's an Alabama fan at heart.
That's not, no. Absolutely
Next
not.
up, though, we have another team in Oregon. I have them at 12 here. Bo Nix continues his hot streak with 3 touchdowns, 3 rushing touchdowns from this team. And this offense, as we've seen, putting up 1,000 points every week, it seems like. We talked about before against Colorado. It is going to be a game where they're going to go out there. I wouldn't be surprised. Like we said, the spread's at 21. This Colorado team isn't as good as this Oregon team. And I think Colorado will be able to keep up for a little bit. But Oregon's offense and the defense is just better on both sides. See Colorado come away with a win, but I just don't really see that happening. But I love to see it happen. I think this Oregon team is a lot better, though. From what I've heard, I have a friend over at Oregon right now. Everyone is very positive about this season. Bo Nix, I mean, it seems like every year everyone believes in him until it comes crashing down. I don't think this is the week that it comes crashing down, though. This offense is still going to go out there and they'll be good. This Oregon team is still good. And once they get into some bigger games, I know this is a big game now, but once we see those big games at the end of the season, we'll see if Bo Nix is really the guy.
For sure. 12 I have Utah here. Still no Cameron Rising for the Utes, and that kind of puts them on upset watch for me against UCLA. Obviously, I don't have them ranked, but I do like them. You have them ranked, which I think is fair. Utah's defense still looks top tier. I know Weber State isn't great. They're not really known for their football program or any program, but they only let up 5 first downs the whole game. So that Utah defense is doing what it has to do. And Rising or not, I think that defense alone could win them some games. But UCLA is going to be tough, if I'm being honest. So I don't know what Rising's ETA is. It's not very clear no matter where you look, but I'm guessing we won't see him against the Bruins, and that could be a really tough game. But with that being said, Utah still one of the better teams in the country. I think 12 is fair.
Yeah, and just like you said, I have Utah at 11. It is going to be interesting, like we said before, with a QB play in this game. I wouldn't be surprised if UCLA can keep this game close, and especially if we don't see Rising this game, Dante Moore could go out there, and if he can play well, limit those turnovers and throw the ball great throughout the air, it's going to be a close game. Utah's still a better team overall, so we'll see what happens in this game. Utah knocking on the top 10. If they get that victory, they'll be in the top 10. If UCLA can go out there, I think they'll be at least top 15 at this point. A good matchup to watch out for this week.
Yeah, for sure. And 11, I'll keep it simple. It's LSU. Jane Daniels, once again, looked really, really good. So they get a little bump here in my rankings. And they're just a really good team. I think a lot of people, including me, were a little harsh on them because of that loss to Florida State. I don't love Florida State. We'll talk about them later, though. They're one of the best teams in the country. And LSU just has a lot of season left. Big SEC matchups for them ahead. So I think 11 is fair, top 10-ish team. So I like them.
Yeah. Next up, I have LSU in the 10 spot. Jaden Daniels, 360 yards, 2 touchdowns. Malik Nabers, he struggled in the first week against Florida State, but coming back to prove that he's one of the best wide receivers in the nation. After that first week, people were talking about it, potentially him falling off this season, but he's looking to make room in that top 2 receiver for this year. Obviously, I think Marvin Harrison has that number 1 receiver position locked this year in the draft, but Malik Nabers is very good, 240 yards and 2 touchdowns. He is a real threat. And with a guy like Jaden Daniels throwing him the ball, this team is going to be tough. Like I've said throughout the past few weeks, that Florida State loss was tough, but with the wins stringing together and some other teams dropping down, I said LSU would be back in the top 10 within 3 weeks. I think that was what I said after the first week. They're back here. They're going to have some tough SEC matchups to end the season, but with Alabama being on the ropes too, with Ole Miss playing against Alabama this week. It's going to be very fun. The SEC West is finally competitive again, so I'm very excited to see who ends up in the SEC championship this year. It's going to be a good game.
Yeah, for sure. And at 10, I have Oregon, who you mentioned a little bit ago. I have them at 10. I do think they're a top 10 team in the country. After a scary game against Texas Tech, who is also a really good team, they looked like themselves again against Hawaii. They got Bo Nix out of the game early, and all three quarterbacks for the Ducks spread the ball out a lot. A lot of different receivers made plays. The Ducks' run defense looked really, really good. Hawaii didn't even get 60 yards on the ground, and on third downs, they were held like 2 of 14 on the day. Now, don't get me wrong, Hawaii's not a prolific offense or anything, but that's just a really good performance. We say this every week with a team or two. It almost doesn't even matter how you play if you still impress me, and that's what the Oregon defense did. Like most people watching college football, Bo Nix is impressing me up to this point. So I think Oregon just is versatile. They have weapons on both sides of the ball. And assuming they just do what they do, I do expect them to beat Colorado. I think a lot of people do. They're just in a good spot for me. I think they're playing really high level football. So the top 10 is a place that I really just had to put them after what I've seen.
Yeah. Next up, Notre Dame. We both have them in the 9 spot. Sam Hartman stays perfect, 330 yards and 3 touchdowns. The rushing game for this team was good overall. They are going into a big matchup against Ohio State. I'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about Ohio State. But this team is still good. The offense is good this year. I would say probably the best Notre Dame team that we've seen in a while. Throughout the past few years, they're a team like Texas, who we see ranked high, a team like Florida, who's usually very high in the preseason rankings. It just seems like these teams are always high. But I do think if there's a team that is legit, this is probably the first legit Notre Dame team that we've seen in a while. Last year, obviously struggling a little bit. And last year, we saw them get beat by Ohio State, too, to start the season. No more CJ Stroud. Overall, I don't think it's a hot take to say that Ohio State has a worse quarterback this year compared to CJ Stroud, but the wide receiver room, it is pretty similar, but they are older now. They are more experienced. Like I said, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but this Notre Dame team for now is top 10 material. We have them at 9, and Sam Hartman has the tools. We've seen it this season to be good enough. They are in Notre Dame, so that changes it a little bit.
Yeah. And at 9, I have Notre Dame as well. I don't think this is a hot take either, but I think one of the reasons that Notre Dame was kind of fraudulent like Texas was QB play. I don't know if Cam watches our videos, but Cam, obviously friend and fan of the channel, big Ian Book guy, but Sam Hartman is just a big step up, in my opinion. He's going to be top 5 in our Heisman rankings this week, and going forward, kind of expect similar things. I don't want to gloss over the Stanford game too much. They looked really good, but really just focus on that Ohio State game. Sam Hartman's looked great to this point. Rushing has looked really good as well. Their running back core is honestly one of the best in the country, and I don't think we talk about it enough. So I'll wait for the Ohio State talk once we get to their spot on the rankings, but Notre Dame is really, really good.
Yeah, and next up, we both have Washington in the 8th spot. Michael Penix continuing to put on great performances, 473 yards and 4 touchdowns. This receiving room overall, we saw 3 receivers with at least or close to 100 yards plus. Jack Westover, their tight end, with 3 touchdowns. This team is legit. This is the first time in a while that we've really seen a Washington team that can go out there and compete for the playoffs. We've said it the past few weeks, but they can continue to go out there. If they can keep building on in the Pac-12, I wouldn't be surprised if they can go out there. It is going to be tough towards the end of the season with some big games that we will see, obviously. But for now, they don't have USC and Utah and Oregon State and Washington State until later in the season. So if they can continue to keep building, that will be huge for them. Michael Penix, no longer a dark horse for the Heisman. I think he is right up there with Caleb Williams. And obviously it's tough to put him over Caleb Williams, but if he's going to continue to throw 450 or 500 yards, don't be surprised. We will be the first people to put him at number 1 over Caleb Williams. Not now, though, but I mean, Michael Penix is legit, and until he proves me wrong, this team is going to be very good this season.
Yeah, and we love future betting on Heisman's. I also have Washington at 8. The arguments, as you mentioned, for MPJ to be number 1 on our rankings are starting to get more and more real. It's not just hype at this point, it's execution. Michigan State is not great, and obviously they have the whole Mel Tucker thing going on, but I mean, they obliterated that team, and that should have at least been a game, and it really just wasn't. The offense moves really fast, and this is going to hurt me to say, but they are starting to remind me of that Tennessee team from last year. If you don't remember, that Tennessee team got up to number 1 in the AP poll at a certain point, so that was a really solid squad. But they actually have something that I think Tennessee didn't offer last year, and that was an elite edge rusher, and that's what I would call a Zion Tapule'Fato. Pretty sure that's how you say it. 2 sacks against Michigan State last week. So not only do they have a passing game and a quarterback that can go give you 400 yards when he feels like it, they also have some really good players off the edge. So this Washington team is legit. I really like them. They're going to be high in our rankings every week until something crazy happens. And based on how solid they've looked, I don't know when that's going to happen. So it's a pretty good spot, I would say.
And next up, we have Penn State at 7. A little bit of slow offensive game for them overall, but the 4 interceptions and 3 sacks kept them in it. 2 rushing touchdowns, 1 from each running back in this game. A big game against Iowa. Obviously, the whiteout, which we'll see, they should be able to beat Iowa by a good amount. I think the spread's about 2 touchdowns by now. If they can contain that rushing defense, I think this will be a big game for Drew Lohr, especially just because this will be a highly televised game. A lot of people will be watching this game. So a big game for him. And from this game, what I want to see some good defense. I want to see Drew Lohr being able to get a few passing touchdowns. And I do want to see the rushing attack go out there too. So overall, Penn State staying in the 7th spot for us. They haven't done enough to move up, but obviously they played good enough where they haven't moved down either. That's how a lot of these teams are. We've seen some movement within the top 5 just because teams like Florida State and Texas have got big wins. Penn State hasn't really played anyone yet. Obviously, that'll change when they play Ohio State and Michigan, but this team's still solid and they're staying in this spot for now.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you alluded to my only question I really have for this Penn State team, and that's if their offense can kick it into that second gear. Obviously, they do a lot of things well, but they're not really as explosive as a team like Washington, for example. But I think they're better than Washington. And obviously, they're higher in my rankings. But as you mentioned, I want to see some good defense. I want to see some big plays when we're at the game, and I want to see Alar and the boys create those big plays. I mean, Penn State has good coaching. Obviously, Franklin is, good at his job. But at the end of the day, the players have to make the plays. I want to see some big plays, some broken tackles, all that good stuff. But yeah, as you mentioned, they really haven't played anyone up to this point that would give them a big boost in the rankings. But we have Iowa ranked. So if they go and beat Iowa, I mean, they would have to deal with some shakeup in front of them, but that's a ranked win in our books. So that's pretty solid. I think it's big game potential. It's going to be a good time. So Penn State is obviously fighting for a top 5 spot in the upcoming future.
And next up, USC. Not much to talk about. Bye week last week since they played in week 0. Caleb Williams, still probably the best player in college football right now. We still have him ranked at number 1, even though Michael Penix is knocking on that door. Even going into this week, I think they'll be able to go out there. Not a massive game for them. Obviously, going into this week, they're going to be playing Arizona State. They should win that game by a lot. Another game for Caleb Williams to show why he should be number 1 in the Heisman rankings. But this team's still at 6 for me overall. I still think they're a solid team, still have a good chance to make the playoffs, but I can't really move them up on a bye week.
Yeah. At number 6, I had Florida State last week. I have them this week. Really, once I made my list and, they're going up against BC, I'm like, okay, maybe I rated them too low. In my head, with a big win against Boston College, I was ready to move them up, but they just had a really weird and slow game that was on upset watch the whole time. Their defense made Thomas Castellanos look like Lamar Jackson, and that scares me going forward because in the ACC, they're going to have to deal with a lot of dual threat quarterbacks, and you have to find a way to contain guys like that. It's never easy, but, no disrespect to Castellanos, he's far from the toughest quarterback they're going to get this year. With that being said, still number 6 team in the country in my book. Jordan Travis, another good showing, and they pull out a tough win. I mean, they're playing up in BC when they have their red bandana game. Obviously, emotions run high. BC really wants to win that game. So they had to deal with a lot of adversity. They still won the game. Just not super encouraging, not enough to really give any movement on that squad. So I think 6 is fair. I think they're a good team, obviously, but I'm not as confident with them as I am with really any other team around this area, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, and like you just said, I have Florida State at 5. I do have them dropping this week one position. I had them at 4 before. I had Texas jump them. I just was more impressed by them overall. They struggled. It was a rivalry game. Like you said, overall, there was a lot of emotion there. Jordan Travis didn't have any picks. The defense just really couldn't hold BC, like you said. Going out there, I still think they're a top 5 team in the country. You're going to struggle at some point, but I'm not. I moved them down a ranking just because I thought that Texas is a more impressive team. And last week I had it very close. I wanted to have Texas above them. I was just more impressed by Florida State's win earlier in this season, but Texas has now done enough to show me that they should be one spot ahead. But Florida State's still a big chance to make the playoffs. They're still one of the best teams in the country.
Yeah. 5, I had USC last week. I have them this week. I'm not going to yap on. We didn't see them this week. Well, we know they're really good, so I'm not going to move them.
And next up, since I have Texas moving up, we now have the same top 4, our 4 playoff teams as of right now. The first half was slow. They figured it out in the second half. Jonathan Brooks, 160 yards, kind of carried the offense. Xavier Worthy, another touchdown for him. That's going to go towards his counting stats. And I am a big fan of him overall and this offense. And it's good to see him getting his counting stats up now, especially in a game like this, because I think he's a guy that could definitely go in the first round. When I came out with my preseason rankings, I had him pretty high. Like I said before, this receiver class is very good, but we haven't really got a wide receiver 2. Emeka Egbuka was really the wide receiver 2 going into this season just because we saw a lot from him last year. But with everything shaking out, I mean, we have a lot of guys that could be in that wide receiver 2 or 3 position. Xavier Worthy, a little bit of a smaller guy, but he kind of has the same build that we've seen from guys like Devontae Smith, who has performed very well in the NFL, even though he's smaller. But Xavier Worthy, a very fast player. He's going to go out there and have a really good 40 time, and a big fan of him overall. This Texas team is still good, and they're going to continue to keep rolling with this offense behind Quinn Ewers. Going into a game against Baylor, should have another big performance from him.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, we're going to have the same top 4, so I have Texas here as well. Started off really slow against Wyoming. It looked like it would be another one of those games that we saw all too often last week, where some of the best teams in the country struggle against lesser competition, but they picked it up. They realized Wyoming doesn't really have a run defense, so Jonathan Brooks with another big game. And the Texas team will still look dominating, with Ewers only completing 11 passes. So I think that's a pretty good sign for the future, considering he usually does a lot more than that. So I had him at 4 last week. I'm going to keep him for the time being. And, you know, as much as I've talked bad about Texas in the past, I've falsely predicted them to lose games already this year. They are a really good squad. As you mentioned, Worthy, Mitchell, Sanders, really good offense. They just have too many weapons for them to be stopped a lot of games. So Texas is going to stick at 4 for me for the moment.
And in our 3 spot, we have Michigan here. JJ McCarthy struggled a little bit, 3 interceptions, but Blake Corum, as he's done throughout this whole season, helped them. The defense kept them afloat, even though they should have won this game by a little bit more. Blake Corum had 100 yards and 2 touchdowns overall. This Michigan team is still good. Despite them struggling, they still won by a good amount, so I'm not going to move them down a little bit. But we still have them behind Ohio State, which is a hot take in pretty much everyone's rankings. The AP has Ohio State at 6. We'll talk about them next, but this Michigan team still showing a little bit of struggles. JJ McCarthy with those 3 picks.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can tell people why at least I have Michigan lower than Ohio State, and that's the quarterback issues. I mean, they're playing Bowling Green. Bowling Green is not that great. I know they're good for, you know, a smaller school, so don't get me wrong. I like Bowling Green, but they beat them by 25 after keeping it within a touchdown the whole first half. And last episode, I voiced my concerns about JJ McCarthy, and he looked pretty bad the whole game. He only completed 8 passes, and there were 3 interceptions. But I think the Wolverines proved that even with bad QB play, they can still go out and win games because of their defense, and obviously Blake Corum in the backfield. I do worry, though, that when Michigan has to play teams with better defenses than Bowling Green, which is pretty much every other team on their schedule, that McCarthy is going to hold them back. So we'll have to wait and see on that. I can't bump them down. They still beat the team by 25. Defense and running game looked great. But at the end of the day, this is Michigan. This is not Iowa. We need QB play for me to have confidence in Michigan. So I just don't think they're better than Ohio State. Obviously, I'm going to let you talk about them next, but I don't see the same ceilings.
Yeah, and this Ohio State team, the reason why I've had them higher throughout this whole season is the offense is just more dynamic. This team, I think, is just better overall. As we see them go against Notre Dame this week, like I said, I talk about that now. They are favored to win this game, which shouldn't be a surprise, really. They are going on the road to Notre Dame, so it is going to be a little tough for them, but this offense overall, I think, is better. I think Notre Dame does have the better quarterback, as we've seen with our Heisman rankings, but Kyle McCord is still decent this year. Trayvon Henderson can help kind of move away from that passing game if it starts to get a little tough. But you still have Marvin Harrison, Emeka Egbuka. Overall, this team, Ohio State, I think is better than Notre Dame. I think they're going to go in and win this game. It is going to be a close game overall. I think if they were in Ohio State, it would be a lot different. But if they're going against this Notre Dame team, it's going to be their toughest challenge. As of now, obviously, they'll have big ones later with Penn State and Michigan. But a big kind of showing for Kyle McCord, is he really that guy? I think he will be this week against Notre Dame, and I just think the team's better overall. That's why I still have him ranked at number 2. I still think they're the second best team in the country.
Yeah, and this Ohio State Notre Dame game is just going to be huge. For us, the gap between them on our rankings is noticeable. It's a 2, and I believe we both have them at 9. And in the AP poll, it's like a 6 and a 9. Nice. But I just think that Kyle McCord looks more and more legit every week. He's one of those quarterbacks that I thought he was all right, but I kind of saw him at a similar level as JJ McCarthy, and obviously McCarthy is someone I'm low on, and he just looks at a different level. I think Hartman is better. I think most people that watch college football would agree with that. But McCord can lead this offense, it seems like, all the way. And their first big stop is going to be against the Fighting Irish. I mean, talked all about Notre Dame earlier. Ohio State needs to keep converting. They need to keep giving Marvin Harrison the ball, especially in a big game like this. Dink and dunks and, short running plays, like those are all well and good, but if Marvin Harrison doesn't have the ball in his hands, they're not going to win the game. I expect them to feed him the ball as much as they can. Obviously, Fighting Irish know that they're going to have to zone in on him. But, with all that chatter out of the way, it's time for them to just play football. It's probably, outside of maybe the Texas and Bama game, like the biggest game of the year. So, obviously, going to get a lot of viewership, going to be a big deal. And, based on my rankings, we should see the Buckeyes come out on top. But, the heart is telling me it's going to be a really, really close game. So super excited to watch that.
And in our number 1 spot still, we have Georgia struggling in the first half, down 14-3. Spencer Rattler had one of those games where he was near perfect in the first half, but Georgia came out in the second half. Carson Beck went out there and they ran the ball too with Dejon Edwards, who came back from his knee injury this week. Overall, this team obviously struggling in the first half, but going into the second half, they look like the best team in the country again. They were able to stop them on basically everything. Spencer Rattler had a perfect game before, like we talked about going into halftime, ends the game with 2 interceptions. This team struggling a little bit. Going into next week, they're going to be taking on UAB. So obviously a good bounce back game for them. Carson Beck can show that he's still the guy out there. They can still run the ball a little bit. And going into this game, I didn't expect it to be this close. I expected it to be a little tough just because South Carolina, it seems like, always plays tough, especially against Georgia. The last time Georgia lost a game against an unranked team was against South Carolina. Spencer Rattler has those games where he can go out there and be good, like we saw last year, pulling out some upsets towards the end of the year. But Georgia, I still think, is the best team in the country.
Yeah, and they just are the best team in the country. They haven't done anything to have them move down in my rankings. I think you kind of checked all the boxes. One thing I did want to say is that a storyline that the broadcasters and obviously fans were talking about during the Georgia game was that in order to beat Georgia, especially on the road, your quarterback has to be perfect. You can't just be good. And I think, as you mentioned, which fits very well with what I'm trying to say, Rattler was perfect in that first half, and it was really tough. Georgia looked like they might actually catch a loss, which we haven't seen in a long, long time. But in that second half, Georgia's defense made all the correct adjustments. As they're the best defense in the country. You expect them to do. And Rattler went from perfect to not great, and Georgia kind of just held possession and held the lead that whole second half. It reminds me, again, of what they did to Tennessee last year. The score was still close. It looked like a close game, but once they catch a lead and their defense just starts playing shutdown football, they just use up the whole clock and end the game. Don't even give the other team a chance to come back, and that's what we saw. So Georgia, they're going to be my number one for the foreseeable future. They don't really have a tough game for the next couple weeks. So looking good over in Athens, and Georgia really solid. Nothing else to say on that.
And with that being said, going into next week, we have a lot bigger games than we saw last week. Obviously, that Penn State whiteout matchup against Iowa is going to be big. Even Clemson and Florida State, the spread for that game is only 1.5 in Florida State's favor. So if you guys really believe that Florida State is a lot better than Clemson, they're going into Clemson, that would be a good game to look out for. Jordan Travis is going to try to prove that he's still that guy against a tough Clemson defense. Obviously, that Colorado-Oregon matchup, going to be a fun one to watch. Utah and UCLA, which we talked about a good amount in this game. Overall, a tough game for both sides, especially with the quarterback play. Alabama and Ole Miss, who we both gave our predictions for. We'll see what happens with that game overall. This is potentially the last chance for Alabama. If they lose this game, the season it's going to be tough for them to bounce back from this overall. I wouldn't be surprised if the AP still keeps them in the rankings, even if they lose this game. Probably put them at like 5, even with 3 losses at the end of the year. But a good game to watch overall. A lot of good matchups: Washington State, Oregon State, Ohio State, and Notre Dame, the biggest game of the week, in my opinion. So next week, there's no doubt that we will have a lot of shakeup in our rankings. So with that being said, we'll see you next week with some different rankings.
See you guys.